Okay, so we're back for part two there after the UPS man rang my doorbell. And so, looking again at the 14th Amendment that we were talking about, the big key there was citizenship for all and equal protection under the law. That the states now were responsible for protecting your individual rights and liberties, where before this, it was only the federal government had that responsibility. So, what that allowed was for loopholes where states, and they're going to find other loopholes in there as well, where states are going to be able to find ways to violate these civil rights. And this is going to be a continuing battle that we're going to see throughout the Supreme Court. And we still have this battle today with it. Okay, so that was the provisions of the 14th Amendment. Now we're moving into the actual plan of the radical Republicans. So I want to go back up to their to the slide that I had from them. The congressional plan was actually three different bills, and it'd be four in the long run, that are going to be passed in early 1867. They now have enough votes to override any of Johnson's vetoes, and they're going to get this stuff crammed through the House and through the Senate pretty quickly as a result of this. So Tennessee had already been admitted, as we'd said. They had already ratified the 14th Amendment. But the other 10 states then, we go back to that Wade Davis bill, that instead of being appointed by the president, they're now going to actually be appointed by the military. So part of this Reconstructional plan themselves is that the 10 states are going to be divided into 5 different military districts. With a commander to oversee each one of these and to register all qualified voters. And part of this, then, because now that African Americans are citizens, and they're going to, once the 15th Amendment is going to be part of this as well, that it's going to guarantee that black males and whites who had not participated in the war are going to be the people who are going to create these new governments that come out of this. Voters would then elect members to a convention. They would prepare a new state constitution, which had to ratify the 14th Amendment. There was no say in this whatsoever. They had to do this. And so then the states start to go through these series of doing this. In 1868, 7 of the 10 had done this. And by 1869, then, Congress is going to add that additional requirement of the 15th Amendment. So let's go down here to the 15th Amendment. So we call these the Civil War amendments, of course. So we have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment is our citizenship and equal protection. And then the 15th Amendment is your right to vote cannot be denied based upon race. Well, it's actually a compromise bill, and it's a very conservative. One of the things that could have helped with the 15th Amendment would have been talked about that it says the right to vote cannot be denied based upon race, but it doesn't say that it couldn't be denied based upon other things, such as grandfather clause, literacy test, poll taxes. And so that's going to be the loophole that these southern states eventually are going to find a way around this. But nonetheless, they had to agree to this 15th Amendment to be able to enter the Union. So when we look at this, we see, and the Klan Acts, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about them a little bit later as well. And so when we look at the radical Republicans, how different it is from what the presidents were. Of course, now this is under their control. It has some similarities with the Wade Davis bill, and they've added this 14th and 15th Amendment. And so when we look at comparing and contrasting them, you're going to have to find things that all three of them, Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, and the Radicals' plan, what they all have in common. Then you're going to have to be able to compare and contrast Lincoln and Johnson to the Republicans, and Lincoln to the Republicans, and kind of putting this all together. The last thing I'm going to very quickly talk about here is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. It's an incredible story. It is a political move that they finally realized that no matter what we do, we're going to continue to have these problems with Johnson. And so the radical Republicans set a couple of traps for Johnson. And this is where we get into question 17. There are two major things. There's more than just these two that occur, but there are two major acts that are passed through Congress. The first one is called the Tenure of Office Act. And this is going to be vetoed by Johnson, and they're going to override his veto like we talked about before. But the Tenure of Office Act has said that the president could not remove any civil officials, including members of his own cabinet, without the consent of the Senate. And the reasoning for this is that the Senate had to approve their appointment. Therefore, the Senate had to approve their firing. And of course, this is ridiculous. This would have been found unconstitutional, and in fact, it will be found unconstitutional later and later rulings. If we even look at our own political climate today, there are so many turns and changes within the administration, within President Trump's administration, and so for each one of these, then that he fired, he could be impeached. Um, and Johnson's going to walk right into the trap. And most of these were meant to deal with Lincoln's holdovers. Secretary Stanton, specifically the Secretary of War, is one that Johnson is going to fire as a result of this. The second one is called the Command of the Army Act, and it's very similar. It prohibits the president from issuing military orders except through the commanding general of the army. That would be like our Joint Chiefs of Staff today. And at this point, this is actually Ulysses S. Grant, who's the general of the army. And basically, he could not be removed except with the consent of the Senate either. So he could not fire his generals. Once again, this is going to be dubbed as unconstitutional in the future, but both of them were designated to stop the president from interfering with any of their plans. And so the impeachment of Andrew Johnson then comes about as a result of this. I'm going to share a little short video clip a little later on the impeachment of Johnson that goes through it. It's very short. It's about 4 minutes. But he basically walks into this trap and that they set for him. He says, all right, I'll show you. So he fires them anyway. They bring articles of impeachment against Johnson. Now, as we should have already known, because we talked about this earlier in the year, impeachment is kind of like an indictment. It just says that there's enough evidence to proceed with a trial. So the House does this. The House then brings about these articles of impeachment. And then it's sent to the Senate. And so the Senate then oversees it. And this was a fiasco. This was the trial of the century. Everybody was scalping tickets to try to get into the Senate to watch this. It is just an absolute mess. In the end, Johnson is not going to be removed from office by one vote. The Republicans finally look around and they realize, well, what if he actually leaves? There was no vice presidency under Johnson. There was nothing in the Constitution that said what happens after the president dies. And so Lincoln's not the first president to die in office. He's the first to be assassinated. And so they decide it's a political move. They get a couple of Republicans to vote for the no part of this, and it essentially ties the hands of Johnson. Johnson has no veto power, and he pretty much keeps his mouth shut for the rest of the time. Although he will come back. He's actually going to, after his presidency ends, he's going to run for re-election in Tennessee as a senator, and he will come back as a Democrat and to fight against some of these radical Republican ideas a little bit later under Grant's administration. And then the final question from part one was, so now they've taken care. So the radical Republicans have essentially one party rule. They control the majority of the House and the Senate. They can override any presidential veto. They've impeached Johnson to kind of put him in his place. And then finally, the last kind of hurdle for them of having complete power was the Supreme Court itself. And so question 18 asks, how did Congress persuade the Supreme Court to not interfere with the Reconstruction? Persuade is an interesting word here. And essentially, in 1866, the court had ruled all these like Ex parte Milligan that we looked at before. It ruled all these things that the radical Republicans were doing as unconstitutional. So in response to this, to stop the Supreme Court from ruling against them, Congress passes a series of bills. And one of these bills requires that 2/3 of the justices support any decision overruling a law of Congress. So to find an act of Congress unconstitutional, they needed a 2/3 vote. So they needed 6 of the 9 justices instead of 5. Well, they didn't have enough to do that. And then the other part that they did is it threatened to reduce its total number of members to 3 and to even abolish the Supreme Court. The court took notice, and over the next 2 years, the Supreme Court pretty much takes a back seat. They stand down, if you will. They refuse to accept any cases that involve Reconstruction that comes out of this. None of these bills were ever actually passed. They were all just threatened to be passed. But like I said, the Supreme Court took note of this, and they stepped out of this. So that kind of wraps up this first half of what we needed to talk about with the Republicans and how they're taking charge of Reconstruction and how the presidents, if you will, lose this power. And so just going back to kind of review real quick, you can see the presidential Reconstruction of Lincoln versus Johnson, 10% versus no loyalty oath. There was nothing, no percentage that was given in there. Johnson, of course, was opposed to helping former slaves. Lincoln was in support of helping the former slaves. They both supported the 13th Amendment of ending slavery. They are liberally going to issue these pardons to former Confederates, but of course, Johnson is going to want a personal meeting with those who own more than $20,000 worth of wealth and land in the South to do this. And again, we talked about how they had never left. When we look at the radical Republicans' Reconstruction, they want this harsh punishment. They want it to be slower. They want it to be under their control. They do give a more than 50% loyalty oath from this. They clearly want to aid the former slaves themselves. They want to strictly exclude the Confederates from being able to hold political office and to vote. So this is the disenfranchisement of them. They're going to pass the Military Reconstruction Act, which is kind of similar to the Wade Davis bill, where they're going to divide the South. It's going to be a military occupation. And you're going to see this. And this is going to have great backlash as well. This is where the Klan is going to begin to operate out of this. They had believed that the Southern states had committed this state suicide, and therefore Reconstruction was under theirs. And in the end, they're going to temporarily win all of these battles. They're going to tie the hands of Johnson. They're going to tie the hands of the Supreme Court, and they're going to be able to push all of this through. And they're even going to be able to pick their next candidate for president, which is going to be the war hero Ulysses S. Grant. And that's going to be coming a little bit later. So that wraps up our brief, not that brief discussion of Reconstruction. We'll be meeting later in the week where you can ask any questions that go along with these. So have a great